Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I still remember the smell of cardamom tea drifting through our living room that evening. It was such an ordinary smell, comforting, familiar, safe. And maybe that's why what happened next broke something in me so deeply. I was standing near the doorway, holding the acceptance letter in both hands. My fingers had already creased the paper from rereading it over and over. The university's seal shone in blue ink at the top, and my name, my full name, sat beneath it like proof that I mattered, like proof that all those late nights studying under a flickering desk lamp hadn't been for nothing. My mother sat on the couch, her glasses resting low on her nose as she scrolled through her phone. My father leaned back in his chair, watching the evening news like he always did, his expression unreadable. I cleared my throat softly. I got in. My voice trembled, not from fear, but from hope. Neither of them looked at me immediately. I got accepted, I said again, louder this time, stepping forward and holding out the letter. My father glanced at it briefly, then back at the television. "That's good," he said flatly. That was it. That was all. No smile, no congratulations, no pride. Just, "That's good." I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he didn't understand how important this was. My mother finally looked up. "Which university?" I told her. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but not in the way I had imagined all those years. Not with excitement, with calculation. She said, "That one is expensive." The word expensive hung in the air like a warning. I nodded slowly. "Yes, but I can apply for scholarships, and maybe you could help with the first semester until I find something." Even as I said it, my stomach tightened, because I wasn't asking strangers. I was asking my parents, the two people who had brought me into this world, the two people who had always told everyone how smart I was, how capable I was. My father muted the television. The sudden silence felt heavier than any shouting ever could. He turned to look at me fully for the first time that evening. He asked, "How old are you?" The question confused me. 18? He nodded slowly, like he was confirming something to himself. "When I was 18, no one gave me anything." I felt my fingers tighten around the letter. "I worked," he continued. "I struggled. I made myself into who I am." I swallowed. "I understand. I'm willing to work too. I just need some help at the beginning." My mother let out a quiet sigh, the kind that sounded more like inconvenience than empathy. "We've already done enough." Her words didn't register at first. Enough? What did that mean? My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You want to be independent. This is your chance." The room felt colder somehow. "I never said I didn't want to be independent. I thought you'd support me." My mother shook her head gently, like I was being naive. "Support doesn't always mean money." I stared at them, waiting for something else, waiting for the part where they smiled and said they were joking, waiting for the reassurance I had spent my whole life believing would always be there. It never came. "So you're not going to help me?" I asked. His expression didn't change. "You're an adult now. Stand on your own feet." Stand on your own feet. It sounded empowering, but it didn't feel empowering. It felt like being pushed off a cliff and told to learn how to fly on the way down. I stood there for a long time, hoping they would reconsider, hoping one of them would soften, hoping they would see the fear I was trying so hard to hide. But they didn't. My mother picked up her phone again. My father turned the television volume back on. And just like that, the conversation was over. As if my future wasn't worth more than 5 minutes of their attention. I went back to my room in silence, closing the door behind me. That was when I finally let myself cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Because the truth was, their words hurt more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what their refusal meant. It meant they didn't believe in me enough to invest in me, or worse, they believed in me, but they didn't care. I sat on my bed, staring at the acceptance letter through blurred vision. All those years I had imagined this moment differently. I had imagined celebration, pride, love. Instead, I felt alone, completely, painfully alone. But something else was growing inside me too. Something harder, something quieter. Resolve. If they wanted me to be independent, I would be. I would figure it out. I would work, I would struggle, I would survive. Not because they believed in me, but because I believed in myself. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was silent. My parents were still asleep. I walked into the kitchen, looking around at the place that had once felt like home. It looked smaller now, colder. I made myself a cup of tea, the same cardamom tea my mother always made, but it didn't taste the same. It tasted bitter. I sat at the table and opened my laptop. Job listings, part-time, full-time, anything. My hands trembled as I typed, not from weakness, from fear. Because I knew nothing would ever be easy again. Every step forward would be mine alone. Every failure would be mine alone. Every success, mine alone too. I didn't realize it then, but that moment was the beginning of everything. The beginning of the hardest years of my life. And the beginning of the person I would eventually become. But I also didn't realize something else. That one day, 9 years later, the same parents who told me to stand on my own feet would walk into my world and realize I had built something they could never take credit for. And by then, everything between us would be different. I got my first job 3 days later. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even something I had imagined myself doing. It was a small clothing shop at the corner of a crowded street, the kind where the air smelled faintly of dust and perfume samples, and the fluorescent lights made everything look a little too pale. The owner, a tired-looking woman named Farah, barely glanced at my resume. "Can you work long hours?" she asked. "Yes," I said immediately. "Can you stand all day?" "Yes." She nodded. "You start tomorrow." Just like that, my new life began. I didn't tell my parents. They didn't ask. That was the strange thing about it. They never once sat me down to ask what I planned to do, never once offered advice, never once asked if I was scared. It was like they had flipped a switch overnight. One day I was their daughter. The next day I was someone else, a responsibility they had quietly set down. Every morning I woke up at 6. I dressed in the same 2 outfits I rotated carefully so they wouldn't wear out too quickly. I ate whatever leftovers I could find in the fridge without asking permission. By 7, I was out the door. I worked 9 hours a day, sometimes 10. My feet ached constantly, my back burned. Customers spoke to me like I was invisible, like I was just another fixture in the store. "Do you have this in a different size? Why is this so expensive? Can you hurry up?" Their voices blurred together after a while, but I never complained because every rupee I earned meant one step closer to my future. At night, I came home exhausted. My legs trembled when I climbed the stairs to my room. Sometimes I didn't even have the energy to change clothes before falling onto my bed. But I forced myself to open my laptop. Scholarships, applications, deadlines, rejections, so many rejections. Each one felt like a quiet confirmation of what my parents already believed, that I was on my own and no one was coming to help me. There were nights I stared at the screen so long my eyes burned. Nights I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe this was too much. Maybe I wasn't strong enough. Maybe independence was just another word for being alone. But every time those thoughts crept in, something inside me pushed back. A small, stubborn voice that refused to give up. I saved everything I could. I stopped buying snacks, stopped going out, stopped spending money on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I watched my bank balance grow slowly, painfully slowly. It wasn't enough, not even close, but it was something. My parents noticed the changes, of course. How could they not? I was never home. I was always tired. I stopped asking them for anything. One evening, my mother stood in my doorway, watching me as I typed on my laptop. "You're working a lot," she said. It wasn't concern. It was an observation. "Yes," I replied without looking up. She hesitated. "You should take care of your health." The words sounded hollow because she knew why I was working. She knew what I was trying to do, and she had chosen not to help. "I will," I said quietly. She stood there for another moment, then left. That was the closest we came to talking about it. My father never mentioned it at all, not once. It was like my struggle existed in a separate world, one they could see but refused to enter. Months passed. I applied to more scholarships, more programs, more opportunities. Most of them said no, but one didn't. I still remember the email. I was sitting in the break room at the shop eating a plain piece of bread I had brought from home. My phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, but something made me look. "Congratulations." My heart stopped. My hand shook so badly I had to read the words 3 times to understand them. Partial scholarship. Not full, but enough. Enough to make it possible. Enough to open the door. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to hold back the sob that rose in my chest. I had done it. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Hope. That night, I told my parents. I stood in the same living room where they had refused me months earlier. "I got a scholarship," I said. My father looked at me. My mother put down her phone. "How much?" she asked. I told her. They nodded. "That's good," my father said. Those same 2 words again. That's good. No apology, no acknowledgement of what I had endured, no pride, just quiet acceptance, as if this outcome had always been inevitable, as if my suffering had been part of their plan all along. I wanted them to say they were proud of me. I wanted them to say they believed in me, but they didn't. And that was the moment something inside me began to change, not break, harden, because I realized something important. I wasn't doing this for them anymore. I was doing it for myself. University began a few months later. I worked during the day, studied at night, slept whenever I could. Sometimes only 3 hours, sometimes less. There were days I felt like I was drowning, days I questioned everything, days I wanted to quit, but I didn't. Because every time I felt weak, I remembered that night in the living room, the night they told me to stand on my own feet. So I did, one step at a time, even when it hurt, Even when no one was watching, even when no one cared, I stood, and I kept standing. I didn't realize it then, but those years were shaping me into someone stronger than I had ever imagined, someone who no longer needed permission to exist, someone who would one day build a life so different from the one I had known that even my parents wouldn't recognize me anymore. University didn't feel the way I had imagined it would. I thought I would feel proud walking through those gates. I thought I would feel accomplished, like I had finally arrived somewhere that mattered. Instead, I felt like an outsider. Everyone else seemed so comfortable, so certain. They walked in groups, laughing, complaining about assignments like it was the biggest problem in their lives. They wore clean clothes, carried new bags, and talked about things like weekend trips and expensive coffee. I walked alone. My bag was secondhand, the zipper slightly broken, my shoes were worn at the edges, my clothes were simple and carefully maintained, washed so many times the fabric had softened into something fragile. I didn't belong to their world. I belonged to the world of early mornings and late nights, of aching feet and empty bank accounts, of calculating every rupee before spending it. I attended classes during the day and worked evenings at the shop. By the time I got home, it was usually past 10. I would sit at my desk, my body screaming for rest, and force myself to study. Some nights I fell asleep sitting up. Some mornings I woke up with my face pressed against open textbooks. But I never stopped, because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant losing everything I had fought for. There was a girl in one of my classes named Sana. She sat beside me during lectures. She was kind, the kind of person who smiled easily and spoke gently. One afternoon, she noticed me rubbing my wrist. "You're working too much," she said quietly. I forced a small smile. "It's fine." She didn't believe me. "You don't have to do everything alone," she said. Her words hit something deep inside me, because that was exactly what I had been doing. Everything alone. "My parents want me to be independent," I said carefully. Sana nodded slowly, like she understood, but I could tell she didn't really. How could she? Her parents paid for her tuition. They sent her money every month. She never had to choose between eating a proper meal and saving for textbooks. She lived in a different reality. One evening, she invited me to have coffee with her and her friends. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to sit somewhere warm and forget, just for a moment, how heavy everything felt. But I couldn't afford it. "I have work," I said instead. She smiled. "Another time." Another time never came, because there was always work, always responsibility, always survival. The exhaustion became a constant companion. It followed me everywhere, wrapped itself around my bones, lived in my muscles. Sometimes during lectures, my vision blurred. Sometimes I forgot simple things. Sometimes I wondered how much longer I could keep going. But the thought of quitting scared me more than the exhaustion ever could, because quitting meant proving them right. It meant admitting that I couldn't stand on my own feet after all, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. At home, nothing had changed. My parents lived their lives as usual. My mother watched her shows. My father read his newspaper. They spoke to me about ordinary things, groceries, electricity bills, distant relatives. But they never spoke about my struggle. They never asked how I was managing. It was like they had drawn an invisible line between their world and mine. I existed in the same house, but I was no longer part of their safety. I was just someone passing through. One night, I came home later than usual. My shift had been extended, and my entire body felt like it was made of stone. As I walked into the kitchen, I saw my parents sitting at the table. They were eating dinner. There was enough food for 3 people, but there was no plate set for me. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. My mother glanced up. "Oh," she said, "there's food on the stove if you want." If you want. Not, "We saved this for you," not, "Come sit with us." Just, "If you want." I nodded quietly and served myself. I sat at the far end of the table, eating in silence while they talked to each other. They didn't include me in the conversation. They didn't exclude me either. I was just there. And in that moment, I realized something that hurt more than anything else. They weren't being cruel. They were being indifferent. And indifference is a colder kind of pain, because cruelty acknowledges your existence. Indifference erases it. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. I thought about the girl I used to be, the girl who believed her parents would always protect her, the girl who believed she mattered. That girl felt like a stranger now. In her place was someone else, someone quieter, stronger, lonelier, but also more certain. Because I was learning something my parents never taught me. I was learning my own worth. Not the worth they assigned to me, not the worth measured by their approval, but the worth I built with my own hands, brick by brick, day by day, pain by pain. And though I didn't know it yet, those bricks were forming something much bigger than survival. They were forming freedom, real freedom, the kind no one could take away from me, not even them. By my second year of university, exhaustion had become my normal state. I no longer remembered what it felt like to wake up refreshed. My body operated on routine, not energy. My mind pushed forward, not because it was strong, but because it had forgotten how to stop. Every morning I woke before sunrise. Every night I slept after midnight. The hours in between belonged to survival. There was something strange about becoming invisible in your own life. People saw you, spoke to you, interacted with you, but they never really saw the weight you carried. At the shop, I was just another employee. At university, I was just another student. At home, I was just there. Not a burden, not a priority, just present. But slowly, something began to change inside me. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. It was the realization that I was no longer waiting for anyone to save me. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. I stopped hoping my parents would suddenly change. I stopped imagining apologies that would never be spoken. Instead, I focused on what I could control: my grades, my work, my future. One afternoon, my professor returned our exam results. He placed the paper on my desk, and I saw the number immediately. Highest in the class. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. I stared at the number, my heart pounding. I had done it, despite everything. Despite the exhaustion, despite the loneliness, despite the nights I thought I would break. I had done it. My professor stopped beside my desk. "This is excellent work," he said. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. "You have real potential." Potential. It was such a simple word, but it meant everything. Because for the first time in a long time, someone saw me. Not as a responsibility, not as an inconvenience, but as someone who mattered. I thanked him quietly, my voice barely steady. That night, I allowed myself something rare: pride. Not loud pride, not the kind that demands attention, but quiet pride, the kind that lives deep in your chest. I didn't tell my parents. I don't know why I didn't tell them. Maybe because I already knew their reaction. That's good. those same empty words. Instead, I kept the paper folded carefully inside my notebook. It became a reminder, proof that my struggle meant something, proof that I wasn't just surviving, I was becoming someone. Months passed. My responsibilities grew heavier, but so did my resilience. The shop owner, Farah, began trusting me with more tasks. I handled inventory, I trained new employees, I learned how businesses worked behind the scenes. I paid attention to everything, not because I loved the job, but because I understood something important. Every experience was a reminder of what I didn't want my life to be forever. I didn't want to stand under fluorescent lights for the rest of my life, watching time pass while my dreams were waiting somewhere out of reach. I wanted more. Not more comfort, more freedom, more control over my own future. One evening, as I closed the shop, Farah looked at me carefully. "You work harder than anyone else here," she said. I smiled politely. "I have to." She nodded slowly. There was something in her eyes that looked like understanding. "You remind me of myself," she said. I didn't know whether to take that as comfort or warning, because I saw how tired she was, how worn down life had made her. I didn't want that to be my ending. I wanted my struggle to lead somewhere else. At university, my grades remained strong, not perfect, but strong enough to keep doors open, strong enough to keep hope alive. Sana remained kind to me even though our lives moved on different paths. She stopped inviting me out eventually, not out of rejection, but out of quiet understanding. She knew my world didn't have space for those things. Sometimes I wondered what it would feel like to live without constant pressure, to breathe without calculating, to exist without fighting. But those thoughts never stayed long, because this was my reality, and I had learned to endure it. At home, the silence between my parents and I grew deeper, not hostile, just distant. We spoke when necessary, we coexisted, but the warmth that once defined our family was gone, replaced with something colder, something permanent. And yet, I stopped resenting them as much, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I was changing. I was becoming someone who no longer needed their approval to exist. Their absence had forced me to grow in ways their presence never could. It had forced me to trust myself, to rely on myself, to believe in myself. And slowly, quietly, that belief became unshakable. I didn't realize it then, but I was laying the foundation for something far greater than I imagined. A future where I would never again have to ask anyone for permission to chase my dreams. A future where independence wasn't something forced on me, but something I owned. And one day, that independence would bring me face to face with the same people who once told me I had nothing. Except by then, I would have everything. By the time I reached my 3rd year of university, I had stopped feeling like a student and started feeling like a machine. Wake up, work, study, sleep, repeat. There was no room for anything else, no space for mistakes, no safety net beneath me. Every decision mattered, every rupee mattered, every hour mattered, because I knew how fragile everything was. One unexpected expense, one lost job, one failed semester. That was all it would take for everything to collapse. Fear had become my quiet motivator, not the loud kind that makes you panic, the quiet kind that keeps you moving. The shop remained my main source of income, but it wasn't enough anymore. Tuition fees had increased, and even with the scholarship, the burden was growing heavier. So I found a second job. It was data entry for a small company. The work was repetitive and mind-numbing. I sat in front of an old computer for hours, typing numbers into spreadsheets while the clock crawled forward painfully slow. I worked at the shop in the mornings, the data entry job at night, studied in between. There were days when I didn't know what day it was. There were moments when I forgot what it felt like to rest without guilt. My body began to protest. Headaches, back pain, constant fatigue. But I ignored it because I'd learned that pain was temporary. Failure was permanent. One night as I sat in front of the computer at the data entry office, my vision blurred. The numbers on the screen began to swim. My hands froze on the keyboard. I blinked hard, trying to clear my sight, but the dizziness didn't go away. The room tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of the desk, forcing myself to breathe. "You can't stop. You can't stop." I repeated the words silently until the feeling passed. I finished my shift. I always finished my shift. When I got home, the house was dark. My parents were asleep. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty space. 9 years ago, this house had felt like protection. Now it felt like a place I passed through, a temporary stop between battles. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to wonder something dangerous. What if they had helped me? Not completely, just a little. What if they had given me enough support to breathe, enough support to focus on becoming something instead of just surviving? Would I have been happier? Would I have been less tired? Would I have felt loved? The questions lingered in my mind longer than I wanted them to, because there were no answers, only reality. And reality didn't change. So I pushed the thoughts away and went to bed. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Farah called me into her office at the shop. She closed the door behind me. "I'm selling the business," she said. The words hit me like a sudden drop. Selling? My heart raced. "What does that mean?" I asked carefully. "It means new management," she replied. Fear crept into my chest. New management meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant danger. Danger meant instability. "Will I still have my job?" I asked quietly. She looked at me for a long moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. I nodded slowly, forcing myself to remain calm, but inside, panic had already begun to spread. This job was my lifeline. Without it, everything would fall apart. I walked home that evening in silence, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. What would I do? Where would I go? How would I survive? When I entered the house, my parents were watching television. My mother glanced at me briefly. "You're late," she said. I hesitated. For a moment, I considered telling them, considered asking for help, just this once. But the memory of their words stopped me. "Stand on your own feet." So I said nothing. "I had work," I replied simply. She nodded and returned her attention to the screen. And just like that, the moment passed. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Fear pressed against my chest. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Determination. Because I realized something important. Even if I lost everything, I would rebuild. Because I had done it before. Because I knew how to survive. Because independence wasn't something they had given me. It was something I had earned. The next few weeks were filled with uncertainty. New management arrived. They observed everything, watched everyone, evaluated. I worked harder than ever. Not out of loyalty, out of necessity. I couldn't afford to lose this job. I couldn't afford to lose anything. One afternoon, the new manager called me into his office. My heart pounded as I walked in. He looked at my records. "You've been here 3 years," he said. "Yes." He studied me carefully. "You work 2 jobs and attend university." "Yes." He leaned back in his chair. There was a long pause. Then he said something that would change everything. "We need someone to help with administrative work." I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. "You've proven yourself reliable," he continued. "I want to offer you the position." Administrative work, better hours, better pay, better stability. My throat tightened. All those years of struggle, all those nights of exhaustion, they had led to this moment. Yes, I said softly. Yes, I would like that. And for the first time since this journey began, I felt the ground beneath my feet grow steady. I was no longer just surviving, I was moving forward. And I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The first day I sat at a desk instead of standing behind a counter, I didn't know what to do with my hands. It sounds like such a small thing, but when you've spent years moving constantly, carrying things, organizing shelves, serving customers, stillness feels unnatural. The chair felt too comfortable. The desk felt too clean. The computer screen glowed in front of me like a doorway I wasn't sure I deserved to walk through. For 3 years, I had been invisible. Now, suddenly, I was being seen. The administrative position wasn't glamorous. I handled paperwork, organized schedules, entered records, and answered emails. But to me, it was everything. It meant stability. It meant progress. It meant I was finally stepping into a life that didn't revolve entirely around survival. The extra income made a difference almost immediately. For the first time, I could pay my tuition without calculating how many meals I would have to skip. For the first time, I could breathe without feeling like the air itself was something I had to earn. But what surprised me the most wasn't the money, it was the confidence. Every task I completed, every responsibility I handled, every small success, it built something inside me. Something solid, something permanent. I began to realize that I wasn't just capable of surviving hardship, I was capable of growth, real growth. At university, my final year approached faster than I expected. The finish line, once so distant, was now within reach. But finishing wasn't enough. I wanted more. Not because I needed to prove something to my parents, but because I needed to prove something to myself. I applied for internships. Most of them never replied. Some of them rejected me immediately, but one called me in for an interview. I remember sitting outside the office, my hands resting on my lap, trying to steady my breathing. The building was tall and modern, its glass windows reflecting a world that felt far removed from the one I had known. People walked past me in clear clothes, confident strides, easy smiles. I wondered if they had any idea how much it took for someone like me just to sit there. When they called my name, I stood and walked inside. The interview was simple. They asked about my education, my experience, my goals. But then the interviewer asked something unexpected. "Tell me about a challenge you've overcome." For a moment, I didn't know where to begin. How do you summarize years of quiet struggle in a few sentences? How do you explain what it feels like to build yourself from nothing? I worked full-time while studying. I paid for my education myself, I said carefully. He nodded. That must have been difficult. It was, but I didn't say that. Instead, I said, it taught me discipline. He studied me for a moment longer. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Respect. Not pity, not sympathy. Respect. I left the building that day unsure of what would happen, but for the first time, I realized something important. My struggle wasn't just something I had endured. It was something that had shaped me into someone valuable, someone strong, someone capable. A week later, they called me. I got the internship. It wasn't permanent, it wasn't guaranteed, but it was a door, and doors had power. I continued working my administrative job while completing the internship and finishing my final semester. My days became even more demanding, but this time the exhaustion felt different. It felt purposeful. It felt like movement, not survival. When I graduated, there was no celebration at home, no dinner, no gathering. My parents simply acknowledged it the way they acknowledged everything else. "That's good," my father said. Those same words, always the same. But this time they didn't hurt, because I no longer needed more from him. I had learned to give myself the validation I once begged for. The internship turned into a full-time job 6 months later. I remember the moment they offered it to me. I sat in the same office where I had once been just an intern, unsure of my place in the world. Now, they were offering me something permanent, something stable, something real. I accepted without hesitation. My salary wasn't extraordinary, but it was enough. Enough to support myself, enough to stand without fear, enough to finally step into independence, not as a burden, but as a choice. I moved into a small apartment shortly after. It wasn't large, it wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. The first night I slept there, I lay on the mattress staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. No expectations, no judgment, no indifference, just peace. For the first time in years, I felt safe. Not because someone else had protected me, but because I had built protection for myself. I thought about everything it had taken to reach that moment, every rejection, every tear, every sleepless night, every moment I had wanted to give up. They had all led me here. And in that quiet apartment, I realized something that changed everything. My parents told me to stand on my own feet, and I had, but they never understood what it would cost them, because independence doesn't just create strength, it creates distance. And one day, that distance would become something they could no longer ignore. Living alone changed me in ways I didn't expect. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. I wasn't used to coming home to a space that belonged entirely to me. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no television murmuring from the next room, no quiet reminder that other people existed nearby. Just me. And strangely, I liked it. My apartment was small. The paint on the walls was slightly uneven, and the kitchen sink leaked if I turned the handle too tightly. But every inch of it represented something I had earned. Every bill paid on time felt like a quiet victory. Every meal I cooked felt like proof that I could take care of myself. I didn't realize how heavy my parents' house had felt until I left it. Not physically, emotionally. It was a place where I had spent years trying to prove my worth, a place where I had learned to shrink myself to survive. Here, I didn't have to shrink. Here, I could simply exist. My job became my focus. I arrived early every morning and stayed late whenever necessary, not because anyone forced me to, but because I wanted to build something stable, something lasting. My supervisors noticed. They began trusting me with more responsibilities, larger projects, more complex tasks. At first, I was afraid to make mistakes, afraid that one wrong move would expose me as someone who didn't belong. But slowly that fear faded, because I realized something important. I did belong, not because someone gave me permission, but because I had earned my place. A year passed, then another. My salary increased, my responsibilities grew, my confidence deepened. I stopped feeling like the girl who had been abandoned at 18. I started feeling like someone new, someone stronger, someone complete. My relationship with my parents became distant but polite. I visited occasionally, mostly out of obligation. Our conversations stayed on the surface. "How is work?" "It's fine." "How is your health?" "Good." We never spoke about the past. We never spoke about what happened. It was like an unspoken agreement. Some silences are easier to live with than truths. One evening, during one of my visits, I noticed something different. My father looked older, not dramatically, just different. His shoulders curved slightly forward. His hair had more gray than I remembered. Time had touched him. It was a strange realization, because in my mind he had always been unshakable, always certain, always in control. But now I saw something else. Fragility. My mother asked about my apartment. "You live alone?" she said. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "That's good." Those same words, but this time they sounded different. Not indifferent, careful, almost uncertain. I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me wanted them to say more. Part of me didn't, because their approval no longer held the same power over me. I had built a life without it, and that life was enough. 3 years into my career, something unexpected happened. My company began restructuring, new leadership, new opportunities, new risks. They announced they were creating a new department, a smaller team, higher responsibility, higher pay. I didn't think much of it at first. Opportunities like that didn't usually belong to people like me. But one afternoon, my manager called me into his office. He said, "I want you to apply." I blinked in surprise. "Me?" He nodded. "You've proven yourself." Those words stirred something deep inside me. Proven yourself. For years, I had lived with the quiet belief that I had something to prove, not to my parents, not to the world, to myself. And now someone else saw it too. The application process was intense. Interviews, evaluations, weeks of waiting. I didn't allow myself to hope too much, because hope had disappointed me before. But when they finally called me into the office and offered me the position, I felt something shift inside me. Not excitement, not relief, something deeper. Validation. Not because they chose me, but because I had chosen myself years ago, and that choice had led me here. My new role changed everything. Better salary, better stability, better future. I moved into a larger apartment, not extravagant, but comfortable. I bought furniture slowly, carefully, a proper bed, a dining table, curtains that softened the sunlight. Each item represented something more than comfort. It represented independence, real independence, not the kind forced on me through abandonment, the kind I had built through persistence. 9 years had passed since that evening in the living room. 9 years since my parents told me to stand on my own feet. And now I stood stronger than I ever imagined possible. But life has a way of bringing the past back when you least expect it. One afternoon, as I sat in my office reviewing reports, my phone rang. It was my mother. She rarely called during the day. I answered immediately. Her voice sounded smaller. She said, "We need to talk." And in that moment, I knew something had changed, something neither of us could ignore anymore. My mother never called me during work hours. Not once in 9 years. If she needed something, she waited until evening. If it wasn't urgent, she didn't call at all. Our relationship had settled into something predictable, controlled, safe. But that day, her voice carried something unfamiliar. Not authority, not indifference, uncertainty. "We need to talk," she had said. I sat at my desk long after the call ended, staring at nothing. My office was quiet around me, the low hum of computers, the faint sound of distant conversations. Everything felt normal, except me, because something inside me already knew this conversation would be different from all the others. That evening, I drove to their house, the same house I had grown up in, the same house where my life had quietly split into before and after. Nothing about it had changed. The gate creaked the same way when I pushed it open. The front door still carried the faint scratches near the handle from years of use. But as I stepped inside, something felt smaller. Or maybe it was me who had grown larger. My mother was sitting on the couch. My father sat beside her. Neither of them turned on the television. That alone told me everything. This wasn't an ordinary visit. I sat across from them, waiting. My father looked at his hands. My mother spoke first. "Your father retired last month," she said softly. The words settled slowly. Retired? I had known. He had worked his entire life. His identity had always been tied to his work. It had defined him. Now it was gone. "I didn't realize," I said carefully. He nodded without looking up. It was time. But his voice didn't sound certain. It sounded hollow. My mother clasped her hands together tightly. "Things are different now," she continued. Different. I waited. She hesitated. And then she said something I never expected to hear. "We're struggling." The words felt unreal. For so long, they had been the ones in control, the ones with stability, the ones who had taught me that independence meant standing alone. Now they were the ones standing on uncertain ground. I didn't know what to say. My father finally looked at me. His eyes were older, not weaker, just older. "We didn't plan properly," he admitted quietly. That admission alone carried more vulnerability than I'd ever seen from him. My mother clasped her hands together tightly. "You've done well," she said. Not "that's good," not this time. "You've done well." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear her, but because I didn't know how to process it. For 9 years, I had built my life without their support. For 9 years, I had carried my struggles alone. For 9 years, they had watched from a distance without stepping in. And now, suddenly, they saw me, not as a child, not as a responsibility, but as someone strong, someone capable, someone stable. My father cleared his throat. "We're proud of you," he said. The words landed heavily because they were everything I had once wanted and nothing I needed now. I studied their faces carefully. There was no arrogance there, no authority, only humility, only reality. Time had changed them, just as it had changed me. "I learned from you," I said finally. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't forgiveness, it was truth. They had taught me independence, not through guidance, through absence. My mother's eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Regret? "We wanted you to be strong," she said quietly. I nodded slowly. "I am." There was silence after that. Not hostile, not warm, just honest. For the first time, we were no longer pretending. For the first time, we were simply people, not roles, not expectations, just people shaped by choices. My father leaned forward slightly. "You've built something for yourself," he said. "Yes." He nodded. "I'm glad." That word glad carried weight because it acknowledged something important. They hadn't built my life. I had. I stayed a while longer, speaking about ordinary things, health, weather, neighbors. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The balance had shifted, not in power, in understanding. For the first time, they saw me clearly, not as someone who needed them, but as someone who no longer did. When I left that night, I stood outside the house for a moment, looking at the familiar walls. I realized something then. This place had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I got into my car and drove home. home, not their house, mine. And as I walked into my apartment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Because independence wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right. But I didn't know yet the moment that would make them truly understand what their decision had cost. A few weeks after that conversation, life returned to its usual rhythm. Work filled my days. My apartment greeted me with quiet familiarity each night. My routines were steady, predictable, safe. But something subtle had shifted inside me. For years, I had carried an invisible weight, a quiet need for acknowledgement I never admitted out loud. Even after building my life, even after standing on my own feet, some part of me had still been that 18-year-old girl waiting in the living room, hoping her parents would believe in her. Now, that part of me was finally still, not because they had apologized, they never did, but because they had finally seen me, and that was enough. Or at least, I thought it was. One morning, my company's executive director called me into his office. His assistant had simply said, "He'd like to see you." No explanation, no context, just those words. I walked down the hallway, my heart steady but curious. His office was on the top floor, larger than any space I had ever worked in before. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, overlooking the city I had spent years navigating on foot, by bus, by sheer determination. I knocked gently. "Come in," his voice called. He gestured for me to sit. I did. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at me with a calm expression. "We're expanding," he said. I nodded, listening carefully. "We need someone to lead part of the new operations." My breath caught slightly. Lead, not assist, not support. Lead. "You've proven yourself over the years," he continued. "You understand the work. You understand responsibility." My mind raced. He was offering me something I had never imagined for myself, a leadership position, a role that carried authority, respect, trust. "He'd like you to take it," he said simply. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I thought about the girl who had stood in that living room 9 years ago, holding an acceptance letter in trembling hands. I thought about the nights of exhaustion, the endless uncertainty, the loneliness. And now, here I was, being offered something earned entirely through my own persistence. "Yes," I said finally. My voice was calm, but inside, everything had changed. The promotion came with a new office, a higher salary, greater responsibility. But more than that, it came with something intangible, recognition. Not from my parents, not from anyone connected to my past, from the world itself. I moved into an even better apartment a few months later. It wasn't about luxury, it was about stability, about creating a space that reflected the life I had built, a space that belonged entirely to me. I bought a bookshelf and filled it slowly, not with expensive decorations, but with reminders of growth. Textbooks I had once struggled to afford, journals filled with thoughts from years of uncertainty, small objects that carried meaning only I understood. Each item was a chapter of my survival. One evening, as I sat at my dining table reviewing work documents, my phone buzzed. My mother. I answered. Her voice was softer than usual. "We'd like to visit you," she said. Visit me? They had never asked that before. I hesitated, not out of anger, out of unfamiliarity. "Okay," I said. We agreed on Sunday afternoon. When the day came, I woke early and cleaned my apartment, not because it was messy, but because I wanted everything to feel intentional, controlled. I didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. At exactly 3 in the afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it, and there they were, my parents, standing outside my home, not theirs, mine. For a moment, none of us spoke. I stepped aside. They walked in slowly, looking around. Their eyes moved across the living room, the furniture, the shelves, the quiet order of a life built with care. My mother touched the back of a chair gently. "This is very nice," she said. Her voice carried something new, not politeness, not obligation, respect. My father stood near the window, looking out at the city below. "You did this," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a realization. "Yes," I replied. He nodded slowly. There was a long silence, not uncomfortable, just full, because in that moment they saw something they had never fully understood before, the result of their decision, the outcome of their refusal, the person their independence had created. My mother sat down carefully. She looked at me in a way she had never before, not as someone to guide, not as someone to correct, but as someone equal. "You've built a good life," she said quietly. Those words carried more meaning than anything they had said in years. Because they weren't dismissive, they weren't indifferent, they were honest. And in her eyes I saw it clearly for the first time. Regret. Not loud, not spoken, but present. And in that moment I realized something important. They hadn't just forced me to become independent. They had lost the chance to be part of the journey. And that loss was something they could never undo. They stayed for less than an hour, but that hour said more than the previous 9 years combined. My mother walked slowly through the apartment, her fingers brushing against surfaces like she was trying to understand how everything had come into existence. She paused in front of the bookshelf, reading the title silently. Her eyes lingered on the older textbooks, the worn notebooks I had kept as quiet reminders of where I began. "You kept these," she said softly. "Yes." She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. My father remained quieter. He moved less, spoke less, but I noticed the way his eyes observed everything carefully, not with judgment, not with authority, with humility. He stopped near the dining table, his hand resting on the back of one of the chairs. "You live well," he said. It wasn't envy, it was acknowledgement. And somehow that made it heavier, because for so many years I had imagined this moment differently. I had imagined anger. I had imagined confrontation. I had imagined telling them everything they had done wrong. But standing there now, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. Not cold distance, just separation. Like two worlds that had once been connected but had grown apart in ways that couldn't be undone. My mother sat down again, her hands folded in her lap. "You were always strong," she said. I didn't answer immediately because that wasn't true. I hadn't always been strong. I had been forced to become strong. There's a difference. Strength born from love feels safe. Strength born from abandonment feels lonely. "I learned," I said finally. She nodded. My father looked at me then, directly. "We didn't realize," he said. Those 3 words carried more weight than anything else. We didn't realize. He didn't explain further. He didn't apologize. But he didn't need to, because I understood what he meant. They hadn't realized what it would cost me. They hadn't realized what it would cost them. They had believed independence was something you could give someone like a gift. But independence isn't a gift. It's something you build alone, piece by piece, often in silence. And once it's built, it changes everything. My mother's voice trembled slightly. "It was hard for you," she said. It wasn't a question. It was truth. "Yes," I replied calmly. She looked down at her hands. There was nothing she could say to change it, nothing I needed her to say anymore, because I had already survived it. My father straightened his posture slightly. "You did it," he said. Simple words, but honest ones. "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. "I'm proud of you." Those words had lived in my imagination for years. I had pictured them in moments of exhaustion, in moments of doubt, in moments when I wondered if I was fighting a battle no one would ever see. Now they were real. And strangely, they didn't heal anything, because healing had already happened without them. I didn't need those words anymore. I appreciated them, but I didn't depend on them. That was the difference 9 years had made. We sat together in quiet understanding, not as parent and child, but as people shaped by the same past in different ways. Eventually, they stood to leave. My mother paused near the door. "You've done more than we expected," she said. Her voice carried both pride and regret. Not regret that I had succeeded, regret that they hadn't stood beside me while I did. My father placed his hand gently on my shoulder. It was the first time he had touched me like that in years. Not to guide, not to correct, just to connect. "You stood on your own feet," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "Yes," I replied. He nodded. But there was something else in his expression now. Understanding. Because he finally saw the full truth. Standing on my own feet hadn't just made me strong, it had made me independent of them, completely. They walked out the door slowly. I stood there for a moment after they left, listening to the silence. The same silence that once felt lonely, now it felt peaceful. Because this silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything I had built, everything I had survived, everything I had become. And for the first time, I realized something that brought me complete clarity. Their refusal had not broken me. It had freed me. But freedom always comes with a cost. And sometimes, the people who teach you independence don't realize they're teaching you how to live without them. The days after their visit felt different. Not in the world outside. I still went to work, managed my apartment, juggled responsibilities. But inside, everything had shifted. The quiet weight I carried for 9 years had lifted slightly, leaving space for something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Closure. Not the kind spoken in words, not the kind that comes with apologies or explanations, just peace. I thought about the moment they had stepped into my apartment, the first time they had truly seen the life I built without their help, the first time they had understood, without judgment, without insistence, without authority, what independence meant. For them, it had been shock. For me, it had been confirmation. Confirmation that every tear, every sleepless night, every rejection, every pang of hunger or exhaustion had led to something real, something unshakable, something mine. Over the following months, life continued its rhythm. My role at the company expanded. I took on new projects, led teams, learned to delegate, learned to trust myself. I still worked hard, sometimes harder than ever, but now my motivation was different. It wasn't fear. It wasn't survival. It was choice. I chose to push myself, not because I had to, but because I wanted to build something lasting, something meaningful. And slowly, I noticed my parents changing too. They called more often, not every day, not constantly, but enough to show interest. Not because they had to, not because they were in control, but because they wanted to know who I had become. I invited them over occasionally, though carefully, always aware of the balance between closeness and independence, between connection and self-preservation. And every time, I noticed subtle differences: pride replacing indifference, curiosity replacing judgment, a softness replacing the hardness of years past. There were moments when the old wounds stirred, memories of that night they refused to pay my tuition, memories of nights alone, tears and silence, fear in my chest. I allowed myself to acknowledge those memories, but I never let them define me. Instead, I reframed them. Each hardship, each moment of loneliness, each stand on your own feet became a brick in the foundation of the life I had built. Without them, I might have fallen. With them, I learned how to rise. One evening, my mother asked me a question I had never expected. "Do you forgive us?" I looked at her, really looked at her, not with anger, not with resentment, just with understanding. "Forgive you?" I asked softly. "I don't think I ever needed to forgive you. I had to forgive myself for believing I needed your help to succeed. I didn't. I learned to stand on my own, and that's what matters." Her eyes filled with tears, my father's too. But the tears weren't about shame or apology. They were about realization, about understanding what it had cost me to grow into the person I was now. In that moment, I understood something crucial. The independence they demanded, harsh as it had given me a gift. Not one they intended to give, not one they had ever imagined I would value, but a gift nonetheless. A gift of self-reliance, of resilience, of proving to myself what I was capable of. They had forced me into a world of hardship, yes, but from that world, I emerged not broken, but whole, not weak, but powerful. 9 years earlier, I had walked away from that living room as a scared 18-year-old clutching an acceptance letter, feeling abandoned. Now, I could walk in that same space with my head held high, knowing I had created a life they couldn't have imagined. Not because I sought revenge, not because I wanted them to regret anything, but because I had learned to value myself more than their approval ever could. And yet, when I look back, I realize the subtle irony. The very people who doubted me, who refused to help, who told me to stand on your own feet, were the same people who, in their absence, taught me how to stand tall, how to trust my own judgment, how to build, how to fight, how to survive, and ultimately, how to thrive. Years later, I still keep that acceptance letter. I keep it not as a symbol of their refusal, but as a symbol of my journey, of the nights I spent crying quietly in my room, of the jobs I took that drained every ounce of energy from me, of the exhaustion that became my constant companion, of the determination that refused to die, of the life I carved out piece by piece without anyone's help. Sometimes I think about the conversation we never had back then, the words they didn't speak, the support they didn't offer. And I smile softly, not because I wish them harm, not because I'm cruel, but because I understand now that their lesson, harsh and unintentional as it was the foundation of everything I've become. When they visit now, it feels different. We talk openly, honestly, without pretense. They ask questions, I answer. I no longer wait for validation because it is already mine. And when I see pride in their eyes, I acknowledge it, but I do not need it. I have earned my life. I have built my independence, and nothing, not absence, not hardship, not doubt, can ever take it away. In the end, the truth is simple. Life will not always give you help when you need it most. Life will often test you, abandon you, push you to your limits. But the person who emerges on the other side, the one who learns, who fights, who endures, is someone no one can ever break. And sometimes the harshest lessons carry the deepest gifts. I look back now and I don't feel bitterness. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for the struggle, gratitude for the independence, gratitude for the life I fought to create. And in that gratitude, there is peace, there is closure, there is quiet triumph. My parents' words once threatened to define me. Their refusal once seemed like the end of my story. But the truth is, the greatest victories are the ones we build in silence, without witnesses, without validation, with only ourselves to rely on. And when those who doubted us finally see the life we've created, it is not revenge that fills the space, but the satisfaction of knowing we were never meant to be small. We were always meant to rise. And I did.